The audio is, you can't hear me speaking? Okay, we'll start the presentation in 1 minute. Okay, so thank you everybody for being here today. Enjoy the presentation.
Okay, good day and welcome to the webinar on how to conduct a systematic review in sciences. So just looking at the brief outline of the presentation and what we to expect from the presentation. Firstly, we look at what is a systematic review, and then the method for conducting a systematic review, and this would form the bulk of the presentation, and we look at reporting a systematic review. If we look at what is a systematic review, it's the critical synthesis of empirical evidence which serves a research question based on a predefined eligibility criterion. Then the systematic review provides an unbiased quick overview regarding the research developments and debate on a given topic in different from that of a literature review, as it involves a comprehensive, transparent, as well as a replicable search of the literature. In systematic reviews does not always involve a meta-analysis. And I think this is what scares a lot of people from conducting a systematic review, that they need to conduct a meta-analysis, which is not always the case. And else we see in the data analysis, and there is other options of analyzing data in a systematic review. Okay. In addition, a systematic review is the production of robust and broad conclusions by producing an unbiased summary of what the cumulative evidence says on a particular topic. And then it allows us to look at identify the relationships in the given field, the contradictions, methodological flaws, the gaps and inconsistencies that will help inform future research or intervention. And it also helps with the development of new theory, also evaluating old or existing theories. And this could also have implications for policy or practice. And lastly, it helps with the decreased need for application studies. Okay. Then if we move on to what is the method for conducting a systematic review, we see that the method of a systematic review is standard in all fields of research. However, it is dependent on the specific research questions that are utilized, in the various steps in the procedure would then be adapted to suit a particular field of study. So when we looked for what to use for systematic review, we found what was common across all these methods, and maybe some stages were less or some stages were more. We found that defining the research question, selecting the literature, conducting a critical appraisal or quality appraisal of your literature included, and analyzing the studies or the results, that was key in every method used for defining for conducting a systematic review. So for the purpose of this webinar, we'll be looking at the Oman 2011 of how to conduct a systematic review. And I think this was a bit more of a detailed process of the systematic review. And I think when it's your first...
Excuse me, can people just please put this sound? Excuse me. Can everybody please put off this sound while the presentation is going? because I'm getting feedback on my side. Okay, thank you.
Time conducting a systematic review, you want to have it into simpler steps instead of jumping from one broad step to the next. Okay, so if we look at what does her method describe, it's an 8-stage procedure. And if you look at stage 1, it's formulate the research question. Stage 2, defining inclusion and exclusion criteria. Stage 3, develop a system. Stage 4, screening the literature. And stage 5 is quality assessment. Stage 8 is data extraction. Stage 7 is analyze and interpret results. And stage 8 is disseminate findings. And we'll go through each stage in detail in the presentation. So if we're just looking at stage 1, is formulate the research question. The research question is approached just as you would approach a research question for any other research project. So you would firstly need to do a background research on the topic of interest, and this needs to be prior to developing your research question. Then once you've developed the research question, then you need to develop a title for your review, and it's generally recommended that you include systematic review in your title. So for example, in our systematic review, our title was a systematic review of online depression screening tools for the general public of South Africa. Then you need to register your systematic review if various boards such as hospitals or ethics boards or also journals that you wish to publish your systematic review in would require that the systematic review is then registered. So if we look at the organizations available, you got your Cochrane, you could register with them, your Campbell, your Prospero, as well as your Joanna Briggs Institute. Then what you need to do is you need to go check the criteria for registration in each of these institutes and see which one matches or is the best fit for your study. In some cases, you'll find that your research question does not allow for registration at any of these institutions, and that would be okay. So that was what happened with my study or my systematic review. We seen that it didn't fit into any of this because we were looking at what online depression screening tools are available for the general public of South Africa. And it didn't meet with any of this. We've emailed all of these institutes and we've seen that no, it didn't meet with any of these, their criteria for registering a systematic review. So once that is done, you now need to go into your exclusion and inclusion criteria. And also remember, when you're registering your systematic review, a lot of these institutions require the systematic review be registered before you can move on to the next step of your systematic review. So make sure it's done upfront and not at the end of your systematic review, because then you will have quite a bit of issues in getting your systematic review registered. So if you look at stage 2, it's define your inclusion and exclusion criteria. And this forms an important part of your systematic review, as it will serve as a guide or reference point when you develop your search terms in the stages to follow. So basically, an inclusion criteria refers to the specific characteristics that a study needs to have met in order to be included into the review. Then your exclusion criteria then would look at characteristics of a study that will immediately exclude it from your systematic review. And then commonly used methods for defining an inclusion criteria for quantitative studies is listed here, is your PICO and your PICOS, which looks at your population intervention comparison and outcomes. So if you just look, for example, if you're looking at PICO, your population would maybe be, for example, say patients that experience a trauma. Your intervention would be some type of intervention, say therapy that was used to help alleviate the symptoms or the experiences of this trauma, long-term experiences. Your comparison group, maybe you're comparing individuals who experience trauma versus individuals who experienced less trauma. And then your outcome would be, was the intervention successful or not? So you need to keep a record of that. Then we're looking, you could either do PCOS, and this just adds another dimension looking at study design. So this is only maybe specifically looking at, you only want studies that are quantitative or mixed studies. It's dependent on your research question again. Then for qualitative, there are a range of search tools that could be used. So we've just given the common ones here. And for quantitative, so it looks at your your Eclipse or your Spice. And again, you'll find that sometimes your these tools are not going to work for the type of research question that you have. So you need to see what fits best with your research question and if it's going to allow you to use one of these search tools. In addition to the search tools, you need to define your key variables. So for example, in our case, online was a key variable, depression screening tool was a key variable, and South African population was also a key variable. So this would come out of your research question. Then you need to look, are you only including qualitative studies? Are you including qualitative studies, or are you including mixed studies, theoretical studies? This needs to be defined. So in our case, we were looking at both quantitative and qualitative studies. Why we took qualitative studies is, for example, maybe the study was just analyzing a particular instrument that was used and maybe looked at the content analysis, did a content analysis on the instrument in terms of what did the experts say about the content validity of the instrument. So that would fall under qualitative study. And then moving on, you need to define your publication dates, and this would be important. So for example, ours, we were looking at online depression screening tools, and when searching, doing the background literature, we found that online studies or online assessments were conducted as early as the 1970s. So that formed our initial date from 1970 till 2019. So every time you set a publication date, you need to have a rationale for why this date was set. Then the language which you want publications to be written in needs to be defined. And then comes, are you looking only for published literature or grey literature as well? And grey literature includes your legislation, government reports, thesis, or dissertations. And in South Africa, a common database to use for this is your SABINet. Okay, and again, if you're not, or you are using grey literature, you need to have a rationale for why grey literature was included in your systematic review. And then the criteria, it can change as the process is of locating articles is cyclic. So sometimes you might find when you go in actually looking for applying your search terms and searching through the databases, you see that maybe your search, your inclusion and exclusion criteria is too narrow and that you get very little articles. This would mean you need to go back and redefine inclusion and exclusion criteria, or you might
Thank you.
might have the inverse, where it's too broad and you're having too many articles that might also not be relevant to systematic review inclusion, but they are. So hence it's a cyclic process and you'll go back and forth. But when this happens, you need to document that this was the case. After initially having this inclusion and exclusion criteria, it was redefined for these specific reasons. If we look at stage 3, it's develop your search strategy, and this can be then broken up into your search terms as well as your search databases. So if we just look at your search terms, how do you develop a search term? So what you need to do is take your research question and then segment it into individual concepts. So for example, our research question was, what online screening tools for depression are available for the South African general population? So when we broke it up, we looked at online as being one concept, then depression screening tool is another, and then we looked at South Africa and general population as other concepts. So this needs to be comprehensive enough and related to the category of your search tool. So for example, if you use Pico or Spider or Eclipse or Spice, then your search terms would then would then apply these type of tools also as well. So you look at what was the population would be a concept, what was your intervention would be a concept, your outcome, as well as your comparison groups would then be also included in your search terms or the concepts used in your search terms. Then you'll find once you have your search terms, you need to look at alternative concepts that describe that specific concept that you selected, or synonyms, plurals, or singular words. So for example, in our case, when we looked at screening tools, the concept screening tools, we found that maybe what else could we look at? So we looked at assessments, we looked at psychological screening, we looked at psychological assessments, just for that one. Then if we look at online, we then looked at online, web-based, internet, worldwide web. We used all those type of alternative concepts to define online. In addition to this, when you develop in search terms, you need to take cognizance of Boolean functions. And these are all so specific to the type of journal or database that you are going to select for your study. So before you go to each journal database that you've selected, look at what do their Boolean functions mean, as sometimes they differ depending on the journal that you are selecting. So generally, and would be requires all the terms or phrases used to be included in each result. The search is narrowed if the search terms are combined. So, for example, depression and online psychological screening. So the article need to have depression as well as online screening. If it or it requires either term of three to be used. So this will broaden your results. So for example, like we said, online or web-based or internet. So it was the alternate terms that we used when we used or. Then not is the use will be included. Because we were only looking at online-based assessment, we didn't want paper-based assessment articles to come out. So we said online and not paper-based. Then, for example, the hash character allows for different spelling of the word. So, for example, behavior, and then you put place hash, it will give you the two spellings of behavior, then will be retrieved in the articles that come out. Again, please bear in mind that this is then your these Boolean functions are then dependent on your search databases that you are going to use. Then if you look at your search engines or your databases, these are field specific or multidisciplinary. And this is critical when you're conducting your study to select these databases, and it would require you to at least two or more search engines or databases. The selection of the database is again dependent on the field of study as well as published versus unpublished works. It is recommended that you look at your university's list. So generally on the university library link, you'll look at, they will have electronic based databases that you have access to. And then underneath each one, it's also in alphabetical order, so it makes it easier for you to go through. And underneath each one, it gives a brief description of what field is it looking at, and is it multidisciplinary or field specific. So that will give you a guide as to which database you need to select. Then database searching, after you've searched the database, there's also another search called chain citing. So your included articles that will be in your systematic review, you then need to go look at the literature review, the reference list of these articles, and see if the article mentioned in the study included in your systematic review, if they are relevant or not relevant. Okay. Then you will find once you start searching the databases, you're going to get so many articles that are going to come out. Sometimes it's not possible to search all 12,000. You'll find all 12,000 articles that have been retrieved were not looked at because saturation was maybe reached at, say, 1,000 or 1,000 plus articles. And this is when you stop and you say saturation was reached in the specific database. So it happens when articles, the same titles continue coming up in the searches, and also when article titles are no longer relevant to your research question. So for example, in our case, if we were only looking at depression screening tools, and then once we got to like say 1,000 or 1,500, we see that the titles now are looking at screening for HIV patients, which was not relevant to ours, and that's when we documented that saturation was reached in the specific database. So it's important to note or document the specific search terms used for the specific databases search. So what you could do is then open a Word document and say database name and then search terms used. So for each database, you have the name and the search terms used, and then you could have an extra column saying saturation reached at, and then that would tell you how many articles you screened through, and that was when saturation was reached. So once you've done this and identified your search engines, it's also important to then download, if you don't already have a referencing software. For example, if you're familiar with Zotero or EndNote or any other software that you familiar with referencing software, should be then downloaded so that your articles that are retrieved can be saved directly into this referencing software to make it easier to document. Okay. And then if we go on to stage 4, this we found was the most time-consuming stage, which is screening the literature. And as you can see here below, it could be divided into then 3 stages. So screening of your titles, then your screening of your abstracts, and followed by full text screening. So what tools you would need in this stage is definitely a referencing software, because the amount of articles coming in and to handwrite it or to capture it on your computer is a nightmare just without a referencing software. And then you need to iterator reliability. So this is having two independent researchers screening the articles or the titles that are coming out. And then a reflexive journal, because you'll see in some cases you'll have an article that seems like maybe it should be included or excluded, and this is often referred to as borderline record. So you're not sure, do I include it into my systematic review or not? So when you have a reflexive journal, you note this, and then your independent reviewers, so your two iterator reliability from your two reviewers, then will say, this reviewer said yes, and the other reviewer. And if you see there's a discrepancy between reviewers, it needs to be then discussed. Should we include this article or not include this article in the study? So for example, if you just look at, if you're looking at databases and you're trying to retrieve articles or titles, and you just put in your search bar, like 2,000 articles that appear to be relevant for your systematic review or your inclusion, your search terms that were inputted. So when you look at that, you need to first, now once you've retrieved or searched your database, you'll see the articles that are coming out. You need to save them onto your referencing software. Once from that entire database has been searched and you've saved all the article titles, you either have the option of creating a bibliography and moving it into an Excel file. And then this helps because it list all the authors in alphabetical order, and that way it's easy for you to remove duplicate articles. Or what you need to do is then go to the referencing software and say remove duplicate articles. This way you know that duplication articles have been removed, but you need to keep a note of how many articles were duplicate, as it's going to come into the transparency of the database. Okay, then you will, in addition to this, you can also, once your articles having been imported into Excel, the titles, what you can do is quickly say filter out irrelevant. So you can, by using key terms. So for example, in the title, if the title has HIV and your systematic review doesn't include anything on HIV patients, you could quickly find HIV in the titles and then remove these titles if they are not relevant to your specific systematic review. When you look at the titles, you need to see, are my search inclusion and exclusion criteria being met? So this is basically, it will tell you in terms of your key concepts. Are they there or not there? And then you'll start excluding titles. So you need to keep a record of how many titles were there, how many were screened, and how many were excluded. So it helps to open a nice Excel spreadsheet, and then maybe under each sheet, you say titles, and then you move on to abstracts and then full text. So this gives you a document, a record of transparency in terms of how this process or screening of the literature was done. So it shouldn't frighten you when you see something like 2,000 titles being retrieved, because once you scan through the titles, the number could drastically drop, and in our case it went down to 200 articles then needed to be screened. So the next step is now you screen in the abstracts, and when you screen in the abstracts, you need to use your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and based on this, you'll see we screened 200 abstracts, but at the end we only got 22 full articles. And then each article you need to look through the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Did the article in text? So sometimes, for example, in the sample, the abstract, the sample will just say general South Africa population. But when you go into the full text, the sample would say maybe HIV patients in South African hospitals. So in that case, you know you're not looking for HIV patients, you would exclude the article. And then because you said it was in full text, you need to have a reason for why this article was excluded from your study. In addition to this, you'll find that there are maybe one study that's written up in maybe two different journals, but looks at different concepts in relation to that specific study. In this case here, you need to combine it because it's essentially one study. So you would combine the three studies as one, and then you need to make a note that the full text, you took three studies, combined it into one, as it was essentially the same one, and your reason for excluding the others, because they know they will just be combined, right? Then I have explained borderline cases, and this would again come up. If you're seeing you're getting too many borderline cases, then you need to go and revise your inclusion and exclusion criteria, because it might be too broad that it's allowing so many cases to come in, or so many titles or literature to be included into your study. In addition to just describing the steps, this is a diagram, the Prisma 2009 flow diagram, which is essential and helps to document how many articles were included and excluded. So if you're looking at it, basically, it's looking at how many articles were identified through your database searching and then through other sources. So this might be through your chain citing, and then how many articles were then removed from because of duplication from your database. Then record screened, so this in how many titles were screened and how many were excluded. Then full text assessed for eligibility, so maybe how many came into full text, and then how many were excluded with reasons. And then finally, you're looking at how many studies were then included into your systematic review. So this is like the gold standard way of representing how many articles in the were included from identification to finally being included in your systematic review. If you look at stage 5, this is your quality assessment of the included articles. So each full text article identified needs to be appraised for its quality in order to reduce the bias in the study selected. Then the quality of the study assess the relevance, the study design in terms of your methodology, the sample, the ethics, the procedure that was used, your data analysis, as well as reporting results. So you will give a score to each study and then determine what score or what range of scores the article needs to have to be included into your study. So for example, sometimes you'll find that the sample size was appropriate, but the statistics used for that sample size was not the appropriate stats to be used, and therefore that would exclude the study because that would be a big flaw in the study. Then this allows the researcher to determine if the study can be included in the systematic review after your inclusion criteria has been met. So when we were trying to find what quality appraisal assessment we would want to use for our studies, we found that there's in excess of 80 appraisal tools that have been developed. And amongst the most used are your risk bias tool for randomized controlled trials. Your Joanna Briggs then has critical appraisal tools that are specific to study designs. So that's another thing that you'll find tools that are specific to qualitative studies or quantitative studies, mixed method studies, or theoretical studies. So depending on what study you're including, or including all the different research designs, you need to have an appraisal tool that matches these research designs. And then what we found most commonly used in the social science was your critical appraisal skills program, and that is for qualitative studies. Okay, so once that is done, and now you have your final set of maybe say 20 articles being included in your systematic review, then data extraction needs to take place. So at this point, it's advised that a table be drawn in order to systematically extract data from each article. Data is then, extraction is guided by your research question. So just like how you would in an ordinary research project, you have your descriptive data and your analytical data, the same applies in a systematic review. So your descriptive data here is then describing your sample, which is now your articles. Okay, so what you would commonly used descriptive data would look at the authors, the publication year, the study design, the sample size and the age range of the sample. So for example, in our study, this was key because we were only looking for sample sizes over 18 years old. Then place and region of sample obtained. So again, in our case, we were only looking at stuff that was specific to South Africa. That's why we needed to capture the place or the region of the sample that was obtained. Then your instruments utilized or your theoretical framework. Again, this is guided by your research question. If we move on to the next one, this is your analytical data. So data we would use as data for your study, which would be dependent on your research question. So in our case, it was the instrument data. We wanted to look at the instrument data. Was the psychometric properties valid in this case? What psychometric properties were mentioned in the study based on the tools that we used? The sample that these psychometric properties were based off in the theoretical framework. So in our case, that formed analytical data. Moving on to stage 7, this is data analysis, again guided by your research question. So you can either have a quantitative data analysis or qualitative data analysis. And under quantitative data analysis, you'll see you can either have a meta-analysis or some form of content analysis can be done. And then qualitative data analysis allows for multiple methods of analysis, such as the various interpretive or integrative approaches that we would use in a normal qualitative analysis. So, for example, if you just look at a meta-analysis and what does it do? So, meta-analysis synthesizes the quantitative data of multiple studies in order to determine if an intervention is effective. So, meta-analysis is represented through heterogeneity, reporting, bias, effect size, fixed or random effects models. And when a meta-analysis is included as part of your systematic review, you should have a statistician be consulted at this point, because they will help to determine whether the data that you do have is sufficient or possible to allow for the various effect sizes to be determined and how you could proceed then with determining effect sizes. Then for the systematic review, content analysis is primarily used as a quantitative research method to extract specific categories of information from articles selected for inclusion in the study. So the data is coded into explicit categories and then described using descriptive stats, so such as frequencies, means, or range scores. Then if you look at a qualitative data analysis, we typically allow one to determine why and how the intervention works. An interpretive qualitative analysis allows the researcher to understand the phenomenon that aids in theory development. In order to select a qualitative data analysis method, one needs to consider the fitness of the research.
Excuse me. Somebody has joined. Is it put down? Thank you.
Availability to resources, the time, as well as the end result of the synthesis, and how would these results be utilized. So then once you've determined this, you would see which type of qualitative analysis listed here would be the best match for your research question or for your systematic review. Then we come to the last stage, which is stage 8, which is disseminate your findings. So this can be done through journal articles, conference presentations, policy documents, as well as thesis. And the way you would represent this is through the PRISMA 17-item checklist. Remember, this is not the goal. This is a gold standard that is there, but you might not use all these 17-item checklists, and there's various other checklists that could be used in reporting a systematic review. So if we look at then the PRISMA one for reporting a systematic review, it follows the same steps that you would use for when publishing or reporting a thesis in terms of systematic review. So you look at, you need to include your title, or research report. So your introduction, your rationale, your objectives of your systematic review. And in this case here, if you are using the search tools such as Pico, because this would be your objectives need to be defined in terms of these outcomes. So your population, your intervention comparison group, as well as your output. And your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Your faces would be your information sources. So what was used, your search strategy, the terms need to be defined. Then the record, study record. So this is when your PRISMA diagram comes into play. How many titles are finally included into your study at the end. And then the selection processes. Did you have two independent reviewers? How were studies that were borderline cases, how were they decided on to be included or excluded in your study? And then again, your data collection process. How was it done? Was it done independently by reviewers? Was it captured on forms? What needed to be extracted? And then your items that were included. And then lastly, then you need to look at your data synthesis, and also you need to state your quality appraisal of the studies, like what quality appraisal tool was used and what was the criteria for inclusion based on the quality appraisal tool score. Then your data synthesis, again, that's like how you would write up your results section. And then lastly would be your discussion section. And then the strength and body of evidence will be assessed using grade. So grade is just an example. There are many other appraisal tools. Okay, and that brings us to the end of a systematic review. So good luck in conducting a systematic review, and hope all goes well. Don't be intimidated by the amount of
Okay, so that was a wonderful presentation by our executive member, Ms. Hassem. I hope that she is available for some questions. Tasneem, are you around?
Yes, Fatima, I'm available.
Okay, so if you'd like to post any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask the question, and then we can have Ma'am Tasneem answer you. It seems everybody is quite clear about what it is that we have spoken about today. Is there nobody that would like to ask any questions? If you're feeling shy, you can post questions on the chat function. Thanks. Okay, so I think we'll stay online for 5 more minutes for any more questions. Tasneem, is that fine with you?
Okay, Fatima, I see there's a question being posted. What can you suggest to be a reasonable number of sources for qualitative literature review? A literature review is very different, like I mentioned, from a systematic review, and it would depend when you write up your literature review. Do you have sufficient literature that is helping you argue your point? If you're talking of a literature review, I would suggest you need to write quite a bit, or have enough studies that you've synthesized that would prove your point in terms of rationale. Why is your study, qualitative study, important? But if you're looking at a systematic review, which I'm assuming maybe that's what your question is hinting at, for systematic review, the number of qualitative articles that come in is dependent on your inclusion and exclusion criteria and how much of that topic has been explored in the field. So for example, in our case, we found that we were looking at the second systematic review that we done, looking at ethical guidelines for online screening. Our number of articles that came in was very few, so it was less than 20 articles. So it's all dependent on what is happening in your field. And I'm assuming, like, if you're looking at something like hot topics in, for instance, now like coronavirus and what is mental health situation in individuals, so maybe healthcare workers, as the years go on or months go on, you'll see an increased number in literature being published or studies being published in the field. So then your review might have much more articles than, say, for example, a study that's looking at something that hasn't been developed as yet. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, so the time period for systematic review, and like I said in the presentation, your initial part, conducting a basic, like how you would do, establish your research question and formulate that. That's going to take your normal, going through the literature, what is the like motivation for why you study in your research question. That would be the normal time you would spend. So I would say maybe a week or 2 weeks, depending on the topic you have and the amount of literature that you are going to include in your as a rationale for your systematic review. The part that takes the most time, and I think people underestimate the time that is needed, would be your screening of articles. Searching the databases go really quick because literally when you're doing that, you're mainly saving your articles and just skimming through the titles. But now when you have to set in import titles, see for duplications, and that becomes a nightmare if you don't manage the time well, because it takes a lot of time. So I would say give yourself maybe a month to do that. If it happens quicker for you, it's dependent on you and how fast you're working. But realistically speaking, if you're doing it well and you have another researcher working with you on it, I think a month, if not longer, depending on how many article titles are retrieved. So it's all dependable, but I think you need to plan your time well in advance, like maybe the chunk of your time needs to be given to screening the articles. Okay, so the question regarding how do we decide if articles are outside the time frame given. When you're selecting a time frame, you need to be wary of those articles. So for instance, in our case, we needed to date back to when online screening or when online assessments started. And this dated back to 1970. So if we considering that as you'll get your key literature coming in that 1970, this is when it started and being documented, you need to use that as a selection date. And then articles before that wouldn't be relevant because you're only seeing that online assessment was conducted from early as 1970s. So I hope that answers your question.
Just to add on, the question says we're doing a literature review. So if you're doing a literature review and you have an article that is really old and a gold standard for your literature review, not systematic literature review, then what you should do is you can use that article, but always look for an updated article linking to that article so that you demonstrate to your examiner that you haven't just used something that is old, because the research is changing all the time. So you want to make sure that you actually get updated information, but also link it to something that is pivotal, if it is pivotal for your literature review. But remember, this presentation that Tasneem has done is more specific to a systematic literature review. So the two are different in what the purpose is for why you're doing them. I see we have someone typing. Tasneem, do you see the question?
Yes, I'm just wondering, is this in terms of a systematic literature review, or are you speaking on a normal literature review? So how old should literature review? I was informed that it should be not more than 5 years. So again, it's dependent if you're doing a normal literature review, you need to look at current developments in the field. I mean, research that you maybe did 4 years ago, you'll find that it needs to be updated in terms of the literature included, because you're going to get new studies coming out showing maybe evidence that supports the current findings or your argument of the literature review, or it could refute those arguments that you are making. So you need to, for basic, like you say, a general literature review, you need to look at recent developments. And like Fatima said, if you're looking at older articles, mainly most of the time would be is if you refer into the theoretical framework that your literature review is going to be based on. So you briefly mention maybe the person who developed the theory and cite their name, and that could date back to the 1920s or 1950s, and then move on and look for what has been added to the theory, what new developments of what criticism, and that you'll find you'll have more recent sources or literature available for that. So hope that answers your question.
Okay. Are there any more questions? Okay, Tasneem, I'm not seeing anyone typing on our side. So it is now 10 to 2. Do you want to wait a few more minutes to see if there are any more questions, or should we conclude the webinar for today?
I think we can conclude. It seems like questions are finished also on the chat side.
Okay, so to everybody that participated and joined us today, thank you so much. It was lovely to have you. There will be another 4 presentations for the rest of the year. Some really exciting presentations, and we will post those adverts shortly. So thank you everybody for being here, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Since today is Thursday, I'm not sure how many people work on a Friday. So yeah, bye. And thank you for being here. Bye.